You don't put fungicides on after the disease is there. You know what's coming. The conditions are right. This tissue sample says my crop's absolutely terrible, but it's the best crop I've ever grown. Think about each of these bars as being the fuel gauge for that nutrient. And as the crop performs, it's going to start using that fuel.
Saying the prairies are in good condition. So go ahead, Greg, walk us through what you got there, and then I'll get back to this poll of how many folks are using tissue tests here. And a lot of agronomists in the group, so we're probably going to have a relatively high score.
Okay, so anyhow, tissue sampling or plant analysis is very subjective to what's going on in the crop, and most people misinterpret how to read them. It's not as black and white as it should be. A lot of times, a low analysis on your report could be because of rapid growth of the crop, and if you're doing everything right in a crop, a tissue sample should drive you crazy because you'll have to keep up with it. So our reports and our analysis are based on our own research data. Most of our database is coming from in-field research. They're not global averages. They're based on performance. So there's some real solid information with the ranges that we put in there. You look at a tissue sample, when you start growing a crop in the early stages, you want to make sure all these little bars are in the sufficient or better zone. Think about each of these bars as being the fuel gauge for that nutrient. And as a crop performs, it's going to start using that fuel. And the higher the level you've got those nutrients in to start with, the more fuel you've got taking that crop forward. So we want to begin with good sufficient level at the start. And what's going to happen as this crop starts to go through the season, these levels will start to drop off. And like I said, if you are doing a really good job, this can drive you crazy. I get many growers call me and say, "Oh, you must have screwed up at the lab. This tissue sample says my crop's absolutely terrible, but it's the best crop I've ever grown." Keep in mind, if you have a good crop, it's going to use nutrients and it's going to use it fast. This is a sample of a corn crop early from one of the highest producing corn crops I've worked with. This is over 300 bushel of corn in one of our research sites. It's a large field, but averaged over 306 bushel. And you can see here we started out in good shape. But this is that same field later in the season. Again, this crop is pushing over 300 bushels. The fact that these levels are dropping off, in fact, my nitrogen and my phosphorus levels are low, does not mean this crop is no good. It means it's really pushing. The idea here is you need to get into this crop and make sure you top up those tanks. So think of these little bars as a fuel gauge in your car. And if you've got a long ways to go, you want to keep topping that tank up to get there. If you're just out ready to harvest, it's not as important. But we want to get to this crop and keep these things topped up. Looking at this report here, when I look at a report, I want to make sure that I'm topping these tanks up before I get to that point of no return. Now, that red line there is what I would classify as a deficient zone where it's almost impossible to make up the difference. So we want to make sure that we're watching this crop through the growing season and keeping an eye on this so that we can top these tanks up before we get past that critical stage where it's basically going to be impossible to fix that deficiency or fix that nutrient demand for that crop. So again, a lot of people look at this backwards. They don't understand that just because the nutrients are dropping does not mean they're deficient. It means the crop is using it and using it very aggressively. And that's why it's very subjective. When you look at a tissue report, you have to compare it to the biomass you're producing, and you want to make sure you're there. When it comes to potassium, we want to make sure potassium's at the top end in the early 30 days, because that's when the crop is starting to develop. And if we don't pay attention to that, you might have a good looking tissue report right through the season because there's no crop demand. And again, we want to see this. We want this thing to drive you crazy as you go forward. So we need potassium early. For every pound of nitrogen a crop needs early, it needs 3 pounds of potassium. And that's going to come from the soil or some other means of side dressing or foliar feeding to keep that up to where it should be. So we want to make sure we address that really early. If potassium levels in early tissues coming back, dry soils or wet soils, get out there with some top dress application or some foliar feeding using a potassium carbonate to see if you can't bring that up. And you might actually not see the range come up within a sufficient range for that stage. But as a crop moves into the next stage, hopefully we get it into this into that right stage as we go to the next stage. So we really want to make sure we address this early because it becomes a real problem. We have to keep in mind that potassium is how the plant uses sunshine. We have low sunshine, we need more potassium. We got lots of sunshine, potassium availability is not as big a problem. But how this plant synthesizes or converts sunlight energy to photosynthates is all about the potassium and the potassium energy in that crop. So it's really important to keep that level up where it should be. In our plant monitoring program, it starts out looks like this. And another thing people do wrong with tissue samples is they take a tissue sample to react to what's going on. You don't put fungicides on after the disease is there. You know what's coming. You know conditions are right, so you put a fungicide on as a preventative. You should be thinking about your foliar programs the same way. In doing a plant monitoring program, you know where you're at. You know that that field's low on a particular nutrient. You should have a strategy in place to deal with that. And then you take a tissue sample to see if that strategy is working or if you need to increase it. So even though we turn tissue samples around in 24 hours, you should not be looking at the tissue sample coming back. You should have a pre-programmed program to deal with these. And the nice thing about our plant monitoring program is it actually has these little bar graphs on the bottom that show you kind of the trend line of where that nutrient's going. So you see in advance the direction that nutrient's heading so that you can be more reactive to it. So this plant monitoring program really helps you manage the crop. And the way you set this up is you soil sample your field, and you've got good and bad spots, average spots, and you set up sampling areas in a field. You don't walk the whole field and pull samples. You go to these specific spots, these site-specific spots to take your samples from, and that's how you monitor the crop through the season. Think about that spot as being your fuel gauge on that field.